In one of the pictures, I have made a ring of fire that I'm sitting inside of.
That's Anne McDonald. She's one of my favorite photographers.
In one of the pictures, I've hung a giant saw blade over me.
Anne used to take lots of unsettling and scary images in old buildings and other forgotten locations.
This is something that I did for like 15 years, either work in landscape or mostly break into abandoned buildings and then do self-portrait performances for my camera.
Anne has traveled all over the world to try to bring a sense of place and the feeling you get from some places that are forgotten or abandoned, and sometimes just capturing these images becomes a little bit scary.
At one point, I was on North Brother Island, which is north of the Bronx, and I ran into a fairly fresh fire pit and a bunch of seagull bones, and I realized that it was possible that somebody had swum there from Rikers Island, which is a prison, and that I was not alone on the island. And then I was pretty afraid.
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, we hear about one photo Anne took in one of Wyoming's old buildings that impacted me so much that 23 years after I saw it, I still went out of my way to find Anne and ask her to talk about it on the show. Anne takes us back to 1988.
I was traveling across the country. At that time, there had been a big fire in Yellowstone. I wanted to photograph with the dead trees.
Anne's trip up to Yellowstone got interrupted on Interstate 80 in Rawlins, Wyoming.
I saw the sign on the highway that said Frontier Prison. So I got off and I started talking to Mark, and he gave me access to the prison to photograph, which was fantastic.
If you'd like to know more about Wyoming's Frontier Prison, please check out the episode before this one called A Walkthrough of the Old Pen in Rawlins, Wyoming, in which Mark Setright, the man Anne mentioned, outlines the history of this creepy structure just blocks from downtown Rawlins. A quick recap, though. It's a very scary, old-looking prison. It looks like a castle from a horror movie. It opened in the early 1900s and wasn't closed until about 7 years before Anne arrived there. The old pen was home to numerous murders of inmates and at least one guard, assaults of both guards and inmates, at least one riot, and one lynching from the top tier of a cell block.
I mean, it's painful. It is sad. You know, it's a place with a lot of history.
The first time I went to the old pen was in the summer of 2000. They showed us the pole where prisoners were handcuffed and flogged. You could still see graffiti and pentagrams and portraits and all kinds of stuff the prisoners had left on the walls, and there were even white blotches left on the cell walls where inmates had used toothpaste to hang up photos.
You look in those spaces and you can't believe anybody could live there for a day, let alone years, and you come away with a lot of questions that you don't have answers to.
I think for me, the biggest question was to know how to feel about the whole thing. I knew prisons were places where people suffered, sometimes rightly or wrongly, but it was weird to actually be inside one and see how small and run down it was compared to what I'd seen in movies and in documentaries. It was also off-putting that now people just took their little kids on tours through this place where so many awful things had happened. I understand that's a big part of visiting a lot of historic places, but in the creepy atmosphere of the Frontier Prison, it all sort of feels like it just kind of happened yesterday. At least that was my impression. Anne talks about the process she used when getting ready to take pictures in old buildings.
You try to open yourself up to the mood of the place and have more of a dialogue with the location, especially let it move you and see what happens.
I know maybe this process of trying to dialogue with something that doesn't talk sounds strange or maybe a little too artsy, but like I've said, the prison really does kind of have a vibe or a heavy, sad feeling to it. At least to me anyway, and probably to other people too. So who is anyone to judge Anne for trying to absorb whatever she could from the concrete walls and iron bars and then make something out of whatever vibe she got?
What I felt in the prison was heaviness and the weight of wasted time, and one day after another day after another day. And I did a lot of walking back and forth, just imagining what it would be like to be in a cell.
What she describes almost reminds me of how psychics apparently go to locations and try to tune in to the impressions they get there. Whatever Anne's process was, a print of one of her photos from the prison ended up in the museum there. This is the one that I've remembered all these years, and now I'm hoping to get a little bit more understanding, not just about how she made it, but probably really why.
So I took that picture at sunset. You can see that the light's coming through the window and, making an image of the bars on the gas chamber itself.
In addition to extrajudicial killings at the prison, about 15 people were also executed there.
I'm crouching in the chair with my arms up behind me.
The chair Anne crouches on is where 4 inmates died in the gas chamber. One thing I like about the photo is that while the chamber and everything else in the room is in sharp focus, Anne isn't. She's blurred a little, as if she's just appearing in the chamber or coming from another place. I get the impression she doesn't have shoes on, but it's hard to tell as the death chair and most of the things seen through the open gas chamber door are in really heavy shadow. From where she crouches, Anne stares with wide eyes into the rays of sunlight coming in through the prison bars and the thick glass of the chamber's window.
So I'm imagining that at the moment of death, that I'm going to be given the ability to fly, and I'm going to rise up out of this chair through this window into the light and out, into the great beyond.
So, what do you think? If you think it's disrespectful to have your picture taken where someone died, for what it's worth, when I went on the tour, almost everybody sat in the gas chamber and had their pictures taken. The truth is, the last man to die in that chair was Andrew Pixley in 1965. He was found with the bloodied bodies of 2 little girls in a hotel room by the girls' parents. I don't have any patience for Pixley or what he was convicted of, but it just seems weird to be so cavalier about death, regardless of who it might have happened to. With that mindset, I didn't sit in the chamber or get my picture taken there. I'm not judging anybody who did do it. It just wasn't what I wanted to do. The gas chamber photo was the only one shared in the museum, but Anne actually took a bunch of pictures while she was there, and she emails them to me, and we go through them together.
The bars look like they're moving through my body because it's a long exposure.
Anne's describing my now favorite photo she took in the prison. Looking through a hole in the wall, you can see her gripping something out of sight, probably the prison's bars, and she rocks back and appears to yell or scream into the air, and the way the light and the shutter speed and her movements all blend together makes her form appear to break into pieces like stained glass or the geometric shapes used in Cubist paintings or something like that. Another photo shows the big open empty space of the prison's yard. There's a mostly demolished wall that sticks up through the concrete slabs of the prison yard like a fish's fin, and it makes a lead-in line to where Anne stands. She's wearing a black dress.
It's something that a secretary would have worn to work in the 1930s, roughly.
Her hair is down in her face, and it's honestly hard to tell who the figure is. A plumb bob dangles on a string from her folded hands.
There's a certain thing about vagueness, about not tying the storyline up too tightly and leaving room and openness for somebody to come in with their own life and their own personal experience and interpret the piece in a way that you might never have imagined.
If that sounds silly or like art talk, the simple truth is when I look at the photo, I find myself doing exactly what Anne describes. The menacing setting of a prison yard that's old and crumbling makes you wonder what might have happened there over the years, and then the image of a woman in black holding a strange object spurs my own imagination to try to make up a story or at least a reason about what's going on in the photo. We look at another photo she took. Now we're back inside the prison. A barred window is on the left of the photo. A great deal of the prison's floor takes up the bottom of the composition, and then, as if the camera wasn't meant to catch it, you see Anne in black walking across the frame, and her image is heavily blurred, kind of like she just had kind of appeared there out of, well, another place, maybe another dimension. The blur is caused by her pacing while the camera has a slow shutter speed. It's as if that pacing she talked about earlier, of moving simply to pass time but not go anywhere, is not only getting her into the headspace of the inmates, but even manifesting a visual effect that contributes to the theme of her work. She points out a prop she'd added to the space before taking the picture.
There's an hourglass on the left-hand side in the window. I think that's overkill. And I think that's often the way that I fail. I kind of feel the same way about the piece that's in the death chamber. It's a bit much.
Part of why I remembered Anne's picture so well was that while some people might criticize her for taking a picture on a chair where people have died, nothing about her photos seemed cheap or exploitative. It really did seem like she was trying to express something beyond just the dark novelty of a gas chamber picture.
But I've had people who have really not wanted to interact with whatever I was saying or whatever I was doing. That it was too emotional, that it was too intense. Like, what's your line between melodrama and saying something that means something? I have drawn that line in different places at different times in my life. I mean, it's funny because you think you're going to be the same person all your life, and you're 1,000 different people.
I asked Anne if she were back at the gas chamber now with her equipment, what she would take a picture of, or if she'd take one at all.
I don't know for sure if I would get in the chamber today.
She actually mentions another photo she'd taken in the death house during that shoot that she likes better.
There was only one place where you could stand and see the face of the person being gassed to death. And there was one window. So I have a picture of myself looking out that window with a lot of fear, I would say, in my face. And it's a little more subtle.
I wasn't trying to shame Anne, but I did want to know what the executees might think of her work.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I was a very naive, childlike person, and I did think that by looking at difficult images of death and putting myself through experiences that I could make myself stronger and make myself tougher.
What she said reminds me of what the psychologist Jeffrey Kotler has put out there about why some people like horror movies. Basically, he says watching them might be a way for people to feel that they're educating or preparing themselves for the worst things that they think might happen. That vagueness that Anne says is important to her work reminds me of the scariest parts of the Blair Witch Project, when you would still hear people screaming, but the screen itself would go black, and you were kind of left to project the worst things you could see in your head onto that screen, like your own private horror movie. I had to ask Anne if she likes horror movies too.
I would not watch a horror movie. I am very easily visually convinced. Like, I live in a world of images. I know that probably sounds funny from a person who sat in this gas chamber, but people are complicated, you know.
I can watch most horror movies with varying degrees of enjoyment or boredom, but the thought of creeping through old buildings that might be haunted by the dead or the deadly, let alone letting my guard down enough in a place like that to focus on a camera and try to photograph myself, seems completely scary. Maybe it all has to do with how Anne feels about old buildings and forgotten places.
Working in abandoned buildings, they were kind of a metaphor for me. I felt left out, left behind, forgotten. And I thought that maybe I could connect with some part of myself in terms of that place and bring it forward. It was me wanting to have this experience and try to channel whatever I could in a place that had that kind of history and that kind of intensity.
I really want to thank Anne McDonald for being on the show today. If you go to AnneArdenMcDonald.com, you can see more of Anne's work. I've also included a link to that website in the description. I don't think that Anne's gas chamber photo is on display at the prison anymore, so I went ahead and have included a link in the description where you can see that photo and the other photos we talked about on this episode. Please check those out. And thank you so much for the interview and for putting up with strange questions from a random guy from Wyoming. If you'd like to visit the Wyoming Frontier Prison, I've included a link in the description that has their times, location, all that. If you'd like to hear past episodes of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, please do a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Every day is 2 words in this case, wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out the past episodes. I hope to have a new episode to you in a couple weeks. Thanks.